The following interview with Bill Porter, aka Red Pine, was conducted for KTAL by Peter Goodman in Las Cruces on September 30th, 2015. Mr. Porter is an expert on China and Buddhism who has published several books on those subjects, as well as numerous translations from the Chinese and a translation of the Tao Te Ching.
When you first got into translating, you'd been in Taiwan for a while?
Well, a few years. I moved there in '72 to live in a monastery, and the idea, of course, when you move to a monastery, is sort of a spiritual practice. In this case, it was mostly meditation and reading sutras, and I sort of just started translating in the monastery. So right away, almost within about a year or so, I started translating as a way of understanding, actually. If you read a text in another language, your language skills are such that you can go through it. You think you understand it, but if you try to translate it, then you really have to reach a deeper level of understanding. And since I'm at a monastery and it's all about a deeper level of understanding, translation seemed like the right thing to do. And so I started doing some translation of a Zen master named Bodhidharma, who brought Zen to China, and the poetry of a hermit who lived in China back in the 9th century, named Cold Mountain, or Han Shan. And so I did that in the monastery, but and every day I do a little bit more. And after about 4 years, the abbot asked me if it wasn't time I thought about becoming a monk, and I realized I didn't really want to be a monk. But they were very nice. They put me up for that long. And soon after that, I left and moved to this farming village, Bamboo Lake, Juzihu, northern Taiwan, outside on this mountain outside of Taipei, where I met you. And so while I was living there, I didn't have... it wasn't a monastic setting. It was a little farming area, and I had had a house to support myself. And the monastery was all free. In the farming village, I had to go down the mountain 3 times a week, to teach English 2 hours 3 times a week. So it gave me a lot. I had actually, in a sense, I had more time than I'd had at the monastery, because even at a monastery, there are things you have to do. So anyway, I kept translating, and as just sort of to continue my Buddhist practice. And eventually I translated all the poems of this author, Cold Mountain. I found a publisher, and when I realized that somebody would be interested in publishing this, then I continued publishing or translating other material. So that's sort of how I got into it in the 70s.
How well was Han Shan known in the Chinese culture at that point?
He was sort of known.
Not famous like Du Fu or...
No.
Okay.
No. But there were, occasionally I would run into people. For example, I had to get my visa renewed every 6 months, because for a number of years I was on a tourist visa. It was a 2-month visa. You could get it renewed twice. Every 6 months you'd have to go to Hong Kong. So when I would go down for these 2-month renewals, and they asked me why I wanted to stay longer, I told them at the beginning, well, I'm working on the poems of Cold Mountain. And they knew for some reason, the people at that office knew who Han Shan was. And they respected that. So every time I came in there, we had a little chat. They always renewed my visa. So there were people in Taiwan who knew.
Han Shan was the first book you published.
That's right. And it was
I remember it.
I think I maybe finished the translation around 80, and it was finally published in the U.S. in 83.
You mentioned you're being in the monastery and spiritual practice. Now, so many years later, what is your spiritual practice?
Just to get through the day and not to piss anybody off. Try to help somebody if I can.
But you don't sit zazen.
Well, I do in the morning usually.
Okay.
And when I'm at home, I don't have any responsibilities. When I'm traveling, it's a little bit different. But just a a brief sit, maybe 30 minutes to an hour at the most in the morning. That's all. And I use my meditation differently than I did in Taiwan. When I was first learning meditation, it was about learning to focus your mind in a way that you could also let your mind go, let the thoughts go that normally and that previously would have distracted you, that you would have become attached to in a way. But nowadays, because I do so much translation, I've come to use meditation as a way to solve translation problems. For example, during the previous day, I will have always invariably encountered a couple of lines that puzzled me. So the next morning, I will bring up one of those lines in my meditation, just as a mental image, and I'll treat it like I would a koan. What's the sound of one hand clapping? What's my original face? Well, I would envision that line, just like a wall, and I would sit, and that line would just be there.
So rather than looking in a bunch of dictionaries or analyzing it intellectually, you just kind of focus on it in a less rational way.
Absolutely, but I will have during the previous day used my dictionaries, checked sources, and tried to figure out what the hell this means. But obviously, I run into passages of phrases that I really puzzle me. So I've started using my morning meditation as a way of solving those problems, and it's remarkable how easy that works, how successful it is when you stop thinking about something, but just it's sort of in your mind, but not really. You're not actively thinking about it, and so that's sort of what I do with meditation these days.
When we were talking up in Port Townsend about translation, I really liked what you said about dancing with the text and not getting too close or too far away. Can you tell me about that?
I don't know what year it was. Maybe it was 2002, 2003. There was a college in Boston. There was a women's college, and one of the professors there got some funding for what turned out to be the first ever Chinese translation conference. And I was among the people they invited, and they asked me to talk about translation. And I had never thought about it. You just do something.
Sure.
So I sat down one day and I thought, how do I translate? What is it like? How could I explain it to others? And that's when I came up with this metaphor of dancing, whereby I'm attracted to certain texts, and I liken that text to a beautiful woman I see dancing on the dance floor, because this language has a rhythm and a beauty and movement to it that attracts me, and I want to dance with it. But as a translator, using English and being attracted to a Chinese dancer, it turns out that I don't hear the music that is causing her to dance. So I'm deaf. In order for me to dance with her, I've got to get fairly close. And I can't dance across the room like some translators would. There are those translators who like to produce something impressionistic, perhaps. And I don't want to kill the dancer. And I don't want to do what most people think of as a literal, accurate translation. I don't want to put my feet on top of her feet, my English feet on top of her Chinese feet. I want to just get close enough to pick up on her energy, so I can accompany the dance with my English dance. I see translation as partnering, becoming a partner of the dance, as an extension of the original text. The original text is dancing on the dance floor, and I want to produce an English text that can accompany it.
I liked what you said the other day about the words of particularly a poem or a religious text, unlike maybe a scientific manual, engineering text, The words are really trying to communicate beyond what words can do.
Yeah, that's sort of what led me to this metaphor. Is I've over time I've published in my different books translations of over 2,000 poems. So I've been doing this a long time, and so it's true that, at least for me, it's true that poetry is, in a sense, anti-linguistic. It's a use of language to go beyond language. It's not really the words that are important. The words obviously are essential, but there's something going on underneath the words, beyond the words, however you want to look at it, that is the important thing of a poem. It's that feeling you get, that spirit you feel, the meaning that sort of runs through you, makes your hair stand on end, or just makes you sigh, or however you react to a poem. And there's something going on other than the words. And so as a translator, I want to be able to convey that. Of course, I'm limited to what I pick up. That's why to me, I can't say that there's a perfect translation of anything. I could go out and translate a poem, and then I could look at it a week later, and I could produce a different dance. But there are good dancers and bad dancers. There are good translators, bad translators. And even for a good translator, there are good days and bad days. Sure. That's why, for me, it's important to go over a translation over and over and over. What I usually do is I'm translating a series of poems. So as I begin from the beginning and get into the higher numbers, after maybe I've done 20 poems, I'll start going back to the beginning and then doing number 1 and number 2 as I do number 21 and 22. And then when I've done 40 or 50, I'll go back and do the first 5. And then after I do a couple more, I'll do another 5, things like that, until I've finally gotten to the end of the text. Because what happens is, as a translator, first of all, the text you're translating is going to be new to you in many ways. The voice of the original author is a new voice, and it takes a while to pick up on that. And as a translator, you have to develop your voice. Every work you translate, you produce a different voice. And so you have to keep going over it and over it in order to make sure that you're doing justice to the author's voice.
The later poems in a collection of poems, or the later chapters, inform your understanding of the earlier ones.
Absolutely, because this author is using language. We all have limitations on our own, what words we use, what phrases, what the sentence structures we use. But when you're first translating, there's things you're not going to pick up on. But as you've read 20, 30, 40, 50 poems and worked on them, you begin to realize, oh, in poem number 3, there was this phrase, this way of using language that now I understand what the poet was doing.
Gotcha.
And also for me as a translator, I come up with solutions that accumulate as I move further and further along till I get to the end of this work, and that I can also go back and say, oh yeah, for this poem I did this little trick with the English language that really caught the rhythm of the dancer. And so as you move along, you develop more and more tricks, more and more solutions that then you can use. On number 89, you come up with something that you could go back to number 11 and say, yeah, now I can use that.
And you presumably you learn the way a particular author uses a word. And I'm thinking of a particular passage in a novel in which one character came from a communist country and is in the U.S. and his girlfriend is saying, oh great, there's a parade, and he's not at all excited because to him parade means a forced march, communist, they go through the dorms at the college and root everybody out to be there for the leader, and a parade is nothing at all joyful. And presumably we all have those different associations with particular words.
That's absolutely true, because we all have usages in a limited amount of time. And of course the problem, in a sense, it's the good point and the bad point of Chinese poetry, is they've been using the same characters for over 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. in a sense, the same words for 2,000 years. But over time, those the usages have different meanings, different ways. Like you say, the word parade can change from one dynasty to another. So it's important for a translator, and you could say even essential for a translator to be well read. You have to keep reading.
Conversant with the period.
Yeah, and not just that period, but other periods too, because Chinese authors are often harking back to the past, trying to create an aura of the past. The Chinese especially love to honor the past. And so if I'm working in the 13th century, I really need to be conversant with the 7th and 8th centuries, because the chances are they're really going to honor that use of language in their own poems.
Unlike our poets who were rebels who don't give a shit about the past, the Chinese poets you're translating, for the most part, went through an educational system where I think memorization, but certainly familiarity with previous generations is essential. You don't pass if you don't have that.
That's right. You could not be an official if you had not passed this exam. And one of the things you were tested in was poetry, your knowledge of poetry, and your ability to write poetry. As an official, you have to write a lot of poetry, oddly enough.
Well, oddly enough, I mean, actually, in a column recently touching on that, I was pointing out that it'd be wonderful if, instead of our politicians having to put everything in the lowest common denominator, use the least creative language they can, if they actually expressed themselves honestly, clearly, even poetically, I think would be a different world.
Be a marvelous world.
I think of you, aside from thinking of you as a friend, obviously, one of the things I think you're a wonderful example of something that happens with certain people where they get into doing something or living somewhere, could be living in an obscure place that somehow becomes desirable later, or working on something that nobody's interested in growing or eating yet, and then that people catch up. And you were doing this when it was certainly not remunerative. You were.
It
just
still isn't.
Yeah. Well, you're at least famous in China, and you get some income from it. It may not be enough to live like Donald Trump, but you get something financial out of it now. But you stuck with it and then became somewhat successful after many years. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or does it feel that way to you at all?
Well, I've been fortunate that I've been allowed to keep doing what was not remunerative, and yet I could somehow get by. So a lot of forces in this universe have conspired to keep me afloat.
Would you be able to articulate, or have you even thought about what kept you going? What do you feel motivated you in the first few years doing that?
Well, I guess
it may be the same now, but
well, the reason I went to Taiwan was because I wanted to practice the Dharma. I was attracted by Buddhist teachings, and so the emphasis of those teachings is on transcendence of what we think of as a material world. And so when you think of yourself as believing that and starting to incorporate it into your life, as you do incorporate it, it means letting go of the desire to have a bunch of money or certain kinds of objects. And so you don't need so much money, so you don't choose a job. I mean, we all need some. So I've done a few things, teaching a little bit of English in Taiwan, and then of course I got married and had children, so I got a real job and working at the radio station in Taiwan where I met you, the English language station, and that only lasted about 7 years. That was my only real job I've had in my life, and since then I've just stayed home. Since I moved back to America in '93, I have not had a single job. I rely on book royalties, but typically right now I have 20 books in print, and I've been putting these books in print since 1983. So I've had a chance to see how books are in terms of remuneration. And it's very seldom that I will make $1,000 per year per book. I could say maybe a third of my books. So we were just talking about, in a sense, how I've stayed alive and been able to keep doing this for so long. And I've been blessed by just good fortune, people helping me financially, getting an occasional grant. I've gotten 2 grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, and more recently a Guggenheim fellowship. And now, for example, a couple years ago, I was approached by a woman who wanted to support me in China. And so you could say I have a patron in China. So whenever I go to China now, she insists that she pays for everything. But in any case, I've been helped. When I first came back to America, I got into terrible credit card debt because I devoted myself to translation and found I didn't have any skills to make a living. I tried waiting tables, working in a bakery, but I would be so tired when I came home that I didn't have any energy left to translate. So I said, "Oh, I'm in America. I'll just use credit cards." And I got in terrible credit card debt. But then I had an aunt who died, who left me enough money to pay off my credit cards. And then a couple years later, I'm in credit card debt again, and the Hong Kong government called me up and asked me to come back and produce some programs that I was well known for in Hong Kong. Travel programs, cultural programs, and so I did that and paid off my credit cards again. Now the book royalties have increased to the point where I make close to $20,000 a year now with my books in America and in China, because 8 of my books have been translated into Chinese, and the 9th one is coming out next month. The book called Finding Them Gone,
which I certainly enjoyed. Let's talk about how you've been kind of received in China, as it were. Here, obviously, it's a good learning experience to read about your travels in China. It's like a travel book. The poetry is interesting to those of us who like poetry. And obviously the Diamond Sutra or the Heart Sutra is of great interest to people who are studying Buddhism here. But in China, it seems like a whole different deal, because with the Cultural Revolution, they kind of seem to have kind of lost touch or been made to lose touch with their culture. And you seem to be, I don't know how major a part, but certainly a part of their ability to recover their connection with their culture. Is that?
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate. It is really strange. I remember when it first started happening. As a translator, you think that you're bringing something to your own culture from afar. So I saw myself as the bridge from China to the West here. But it turns out the people who have been most inspired and interested in my work are not in America; they're in China. It's true, they had lost touch with a lot of elements of their traditional culture, and they're discovering it again now. And for some reason, my books that I was writing, that when they were translated into Chinese, just sort of hit at the right time, came out at the right time. And like my book on Chinese hermits, where I interviewed a bunch of Chinese hermits, came out in China and it sold 250,000 copies, and resulted in the creation of a hermit association to help support people who seek seclusion in China.
People who are listening and may not be familiar with it, can you say something about the long tradition of mountain hermits in China?
Well, the oldest records we have in China go back up to close to 2000 BC. Inscriptions on bronzes and so forth. And even among those early inscriptions, we have stories about hermits. There have always been hermits in China, and but they play a different role, and a very important role in Chinese society. They are probably originated out of the shaman tradition, whereby there are certain members of tribal societies who leave the society temporarily to have a vision of where they might direct their fellow tribesmen to go find the buffalo, or to whether or not to to migrate in this direction or that direction, or where the plants are this year that they're not finding. So there have always been shamans among all the Central Asian people, certainly, and so as Chinese civilization,
and among the natives here, for that matter.
That's right. And so there's always been somebody in the community who always left the community for short periods of time, who would then come back and assist the people they grew up with. And so that's what the role of the hermit in China is. And so as civilization developed, these shamans became what we know now as Taoists, who go into the mountains for meditations and whatnot. But of course, the origin of Chinese medicine is simply the experiments of these Taoists going into the mountains and testing certain plants for the reaction they have in terms of what they can perceive, their spiritual power. And so when Buddhism comes to China, it also had this tradition of people spending periods of time alone. And when Confucianism developed in China, it also piggybacked on this tradition whereby you study with a master for a certain period of time, but then you go live alone for a while too. All the early Confucian academies were all at the foot of mountains, and there would be a central building where you would have your classes, and then you were expected to either build your own hut or move into a hut, have somebody build it for you, maybe a 5-10 minute walk away. And so all the spiritual traditions of China have had this tradition whereby certain people who follow that path feel called to reach a deeper level of understanding, and those are the hermits.
And that deeper level of understanding is recognized and honored by others of their belief system when they come back, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there have been emperors in China who have tried to turn their thrones over to hermits, or they have at least sent their officials out into the mountains to find hermits worthy of serving at court as ministers, and that has happened over and over throughout the dynasties until modern times. People living in huts were sought out for their wisdom. That's been a very important role until modern times. But even though hermits are no longer being called to take part in the government, and of course there's probably part of the reason why is because of the nature of the government these days, but there's still hermits. In fact, when I did my initial interviews with hermits in the Zhongnan Mountains south of Xi'an, there were about 200 hermits living south of Xi'an. And I was asked I was the subject of a documentary 2 years ago in those same range of mountains, in the same area, and 2 years ago there were 600 hermits living in that same area. So there are 3 times more hermits living there now. And when I first interviewed hermits, they were usually mostly uneducated, but spiritually profound practitioners, very devoted practitioners of Taoist and Buddhist religion. But nowadays you're getting a lot of university graduates, doctors, lawyers, professionals in short, who have, shall we say, seen through the red dust. They've had a chance to make money and become successful in a career path, but they've realized, because Chinese culture has these lessons, these teachings out there waiting for them to discover. In the West, not so much. We don't put on a pedestal the idea of renunciation. Right. But in these Chinese traditions, renunciation is always been put on a pedestal and praised and admired.
The early Christian mystics.
There are, but not so much anymore.
They're not much heard of these days. I love the fact that when you first went to interview the hermits, everybody said there are no hermits any longer.
That's true, and that's probably why my books have sold so much, because I've been reintroducing these things to the Chinese who thought they were gone.
How would you articulate what a hermit gains internally from being a hermit?
Well, in its simplest form, you would say that a hermit actualizes the teaching of their spiritual path. And as I just mentioned the word renunciation, the first thing they do is, to be a hermit, you have to live on next to nothing. So, in a sense, you learn to let go, and you learn that you can let go and still survive. And so, hermits learn to let go of the things that weigh us all down. We worry about paying the rent. We worry about paying for these bills that we have to pay every month just to stay alive. And hermits live on next to nothing in the mountains, and they stay alive. So they let go, and they're alone. So they learn how to be alone, and the importance of accessing something inside of yourself in this life without the constant distractions of having to please other people or deal with other people. So these hermits learn to let go. They learn how to be with themselves, but it's not like they're ignoring other people either, because the hermit tradition is usually like our graduate school. You spend around 3 to 5 years as a hermit normally in China, and then you come down the mountain, and then you become a teacher of others. And
the being alone part of it, that strikes me as something that, aside from any religious content or context, simply being alone without television and the internet and a cell phone now and other people and work is something I don't think most people could do.
That's right. You're right. And that's why, like I say, this is sort of graduate school. And it's certainly crowded mountains.
How would you articulate what someone would get? I mean, someone who's listening to this says, oh, that sounds cool. I think I'll go out in the desert for a month by myself. How would you articulate what you imagine that person might gain from that?
They wouldn't gain anything. In fact, it would be just the opposite. It's more a question of what they would lose. They would lose a lot. They would lose their attachments to things. But it's important to pause here and say that these graduate students of spirituality in China require an undergraduate degree. And so if you just want to go off to the mountains for a period, well, you can do that, but you're probably not going to spend a very long period there unless it's unless it's the end of a spiritual career, unless you have a reason to be there, because you're going to have so much hardship in the mountains, so much doubt. It's going to get cold. You're going to be hungry.
And what I think you're saying is that if you have a basis, if you have some spiritual roots, let's say, in a practice or a concept such as Buddhism, that will arm you for dealing with that aloneness.
Yeah, and it's true, I'd say, for anybody on a spiritual path. The Christian mystics were like this. I have a friend who grew up at Gethsemane, for example, who tells me that Gethsemane finds it really hard to find monks now to live there. People nowadays aren't attracted to the spiritual career in this way. People, if they are spiritually inclined, will maybe limit themselves to reading some books and taking part once a week in the local zendo or the local church, something like that, but still living their life in society without letting it go.
By the way, a wonderful Catholic monastery in northern New Mexico.
I've been to it, Christ in the Desert.
Yeah,
but the trouble with that church is that most of the people there are not from America.
I know. What put it back in mind was you're saying they're finding it hard to find people to live there, and that's certainly
it's true.
You're absolutely right about that.
But anyway, it's worth trying, but it's probably not a good thing to go into the wilds unprepared spiritually, because then you'll be a failure, and you will look on this spiritual path as a failure, and turn your back on it. So I think it's important to prepare yourself properly if you're going to think of that as a goal.
And speaking of that, when we were talking the other night about the concept of emptiness and the idea that Buddhism recognizes that everything we're seeing is in a sense illusion, it's in a sense in the mind, and I thought you clarified very well why emptiness doesn't exactly mean emptiness.
That's true. It's a hard word to translate. When the Indians started talking about things as shunyata, they had a hard time explaining shunyata. And when shunyata was translated into Chinese, the Chinese Buddhists had a hard time explaining to their fellow countrymen what the word kung really meant. And now that shunyata and kung are translated into the word emptiness, we here in the West have a hard time explaining that word or using that word without creating confusion about it. And it's really hard to settle on a word that conveys the meaning without at the same time creating confusion about it. So emptiness does require a little bit of a commentary if you're going to write about it. And the way the Buddhists look at emptiness is this. As you said, they look at everything as illusion. But what's the illusion is the thingness. It's as if we live in a world of material objects. That's the way we look at things. And if you think of every one of those objects as having a line around it, and is thus a separate thing. And if you think of all the million things around you being demarcated by a set of lines, think of all that as a very extensive, intricate fishing net. And then the Buddhist concept is to grab a hold of that fishing net and to remove the net. So nothing has changed except the lines dividing things.
So that as I sit here, I see Bill, I see the bookcase with all the gardening books, and I see the cactus, and they're finite individual things. And if I am more enlightened and can get my arms around the concept of emptiness, it's not that any of those disappear, it's just that they don't have what the philosophers or some lawyers call vacuum boundaries, but they don't have sharp lines defining them. So they're all still there, but as part of something else.
Yeah, that's right. And so sense? Right, and so the result of this sort of insight, which we could call wisdom, is compassion. Because if the difference between you and me is not real, well then I'm concerned about you. Your pain is something I share when I'm able to perceive it. And so also in terms of things, this thing is not, when I know that thing is, individuality is not real, I'm less likely to become attached to it or interested in making a huge effort on behalf of that thing, whether that thing is a new TV or a car or whatever, a house. We don't normally think of all the things that we've burdened ourselves with as burdens. We just take it for granted that I have to have this because my neighbor has it, my friends have it. But when you take this other perspective, which is obviously the result not just of reading it in a book, but of meditating on it and seeing it whether or not you think it's a valid perspective. But once you're able to see that, then you're much less likely to be burdened by physical objects and the need to spend your life working on behalf of acquiring them.
I often think of a professor here 40-some years ago. He became chairman of the English department, Bob Wickert, and he used to say everything's in the hands of its enemies. And it's a profound observation that I think of often. The schools certainly are, in terms of administrators, not teachers or students. The government seems to be. Most churches seem to be, in the sense that Christian churches here often seem to express, it used to be racism, they don't do that now, but a closed-mindedness and an intolerance and a judgmentalness that doesn't fit with the Bible generally, and certainly not with what Christ had to say. But it's his supposed heirs who are sometimes, not always, certainly, the least Christian people around. And this is a long-winded way to get to my question, but a lot of people, when we were young, would read about Buddhism here, and they'd grown up in the Christian tradition, they'd seen the hypocrisy of most of the people teaching the religion, and they didn't see that in Buddhism because they were just reading the text, or a translation of the text. to what degree is it also true in Buddhist churches or Buddhist temples, organizations in China or Taiwan, that they're in the hands of their enemies, that the people running them are careerists or administrators or politicians, fundraisers, more than sort of true Buddhists? So is it as true there as here? And if it is not, why not?
I don't think it's as true there as it is here. And I think, but the reason that I would think that it's not is because take a church, for example. Well, you have let's say the teacher who occupies the pulpit of the church, but the people who come to that church only come there once a week, unless of course there could be the exception with a funeral or a marriage or something like that. But there's nobody living in that power structure other than the person on top. Whereas in these monasteries and nunneries, the Buddhist and Taoist ones that I'm aware of, there's certainly people who come once a week, but there's a bunch of people who are living there, and it's harder for, say, those on top of that power structure to hide their shall we say, their faults, because there's others who will call them out on it. There's always that danger, and there's certainly there's monasteries or nunneries where you get jerks in charge. I mean, it happens everywhere. We're humans. But I don't think there's really any real difference once you start practicing a spiritual path. I think if you're trying to be more like Christ, then you're going to end up being more like the Buddha. I mean, and vice versa. If you're more like the Buddha, you're more like Christ. I mean, it's just that organizations that develop on the basis of some teacher's wisdom are corrupted by the nature of organizations, and the fact that the people running them are attracted to these teachings, but then they fall back on our human foibles. But what are you going to do? You got to try.
Yep. You've essentially done, in your 20 books, probably more than half of them are translations, and then you have some books like The Road to Heaven, the Hermit book, and Finding Them Gone, the most recent one, and Zen Baggage, where you're describing a particular trip you took, usually with a particular theme, like Finding the Hermits, or in Finding Them Gone. Let's talk about that for a moment.
Well, these books that I've written are all share something in common. They were written by somebody with no training as a writer, namely me. But actually, it's not completely true. Well, I met you at a radio station in Taiwan, where we used to use wire services to get our news, and the news would come across these teletype machines, not computers. And so the news director would often rip off a long piece of news coming off of Reuters or UPI that would off a teletype machine that would be 2 or 3 pages, 2 or 3 feet long of this paper, and he would hand it to us and say, Peter, give me 15 seconds on that. The thing about writing for time is that you really learn how to find the story. You find in this 2 or 3 pages, you're going to find 15 seconds, and so when you first type it out, and then you read it to yourself, maybe it's 45 seconds. And then you take out some words, then it's 30 seconds. And you take out some more words, and finally it's 15 seconds, and you realize the story is still there. And so I learned how to write at this radio station in Taiwan. And when the boss moved to Hong Kong, he asked me to do that kind of writing, but do it as fluff. They were going to use what they called the CNN clock in 1991, where every 30 minutes you have so many minutes of hard news, so many minutes of sports, whatever, and every 30 minutes you have 1 2-minute piece of fluff.
Well, you demean it as fluff, but
that's what they called it, and
I know,
it means entertaining, something entertaining.
Features.
And so they hired me as the feature editor, and I came up with the idea of going to the mouth of the Yellow River and traveling to the source, and they liked that idea. And so I produced 240 pieces of fluff where I would take a trip and I would travel. And so every day I would accumulate enough information, enough stories, enough stuff. So when I came back to Hong Kong, I could write six pieces of fluff, because I would take a 6-week trip and I would come back to Hong Kong, and in 12 weeks I would be 6 weeks ahead again. So I had to, every day I had to travel and look around and see, I can write about that, oh, I can write about this, and maybe I'll pick up a brochure at a museum over here. But what I learned is it's a neat way of writing is to take a trip, because you can write about your personal experiences in traveling, but then you're traveling through time, the history, and so things have happened historically along the route you're traveling. So you can travel, you can talk about that, and you're going to meet human beings along this trip, and so you meet somebody out in the farm field or the bus driver or whatever. You talk about them. There's all kinds of different threads.
And
in
I
short.
think what anybody listening who might pick up Finding Them Gone or Zen Baggage will delight in, I certainly did, and some of my friends read Finding Them Gone, is the seamless web where the translation of a really profound and wonderful but simple poem and some arcane information about Confucius or an ancient poet or a Zen practitioner and teacher is mixed in with how the shoes feel and whether or not you can get a bath and whether the taxi driver tries to rip you off or invites you home for supper and all of that kind of travelogue type stuff. It's just a seamless web where you're not either focusing purely on how it feels to be traveling somewhere, which is kind of egotistical way to do it, but you're also not putting that stuff in the closet somewhere and writing about the great subjects you're writing about. It's just all there, as it would be if we were traveling with you.
Well, that's the finished product. That's
I didn't mean to suggest it didn't take a lot of work.
Yeah, well, in fact, when I wrote Zen Baggage, which is based on the trying to travel through China in a certain direction, and at the same time unfolding the history of Zen, and then also meeting these Zen masters and interviewing them and talking about their life stories, and that when I first wrote that, I hadn't actually written anything for a while since the Hermit book, so I asked this woman I knew who was a really great editor to be my editor. And so I sent her that manuscript, and I got it back, and the margins were littered with a single word. Over and over, she would use the same word over and over and over. Blah, 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 blah. And that's really important for a writer, is to have an editor like that who can spot your digressions that are becoming annoyingly long.
I have one. She's right in the other room.
It's really so important to have an editor, and so few of us who write have an editor. At the beginning, you write something and you keep writing, and sometimes you feel to tell this story, I need that fact, and I need this fact, and I need that fact. But to have somebody tell you that you don't need those facts is really important. And most publishers cannot afford good editors anymore. The nature of the game, publishing is on the ropes. So you're going to have to learn how to edit yourself, and that's really hard. And of course, it's hard to have a friend who'll be your editor, because it's the best way to lose a friend is to ask them to read your manuscript. So I was really lucky with Zen Baggage, for example, to have this person to tell me when my stories were becoming too long, too verbose. So if Zen Baggage reads well or Finding Them Gone, it's because it's gone through extensive editing and rewriting.
I learned the same thing, and as a fiction writer, you're supposed to learn that from journalism. Turn in your story and the editor edits it. But when I was a young reporter, I never really had that experience. They loved what I wrote and they published it just as it was, and there it was. So I never really learned that. But when I became a lawyer and you're writing a brief trying to mix the facts and the law and write something that will grab the judge's heart and mind and be persuasive, and there's a lot of money involved, a lot of smart people are looking at everything you write, and it becomes a product of several minds and boils it down into a pretty neat way, or a pretty effective way. For people who haven't read it, let's talk about the latest book, Finding Them Gone. And what you did there, as I understand it, is you went to either the birthplaces or the graves or a monument to or an old cottage that belonged to or the site of one, ancient Chinese poets, a finite number of them, and you took along real high-class bourbon to share with them, and basically wrote about the experience of traveling and finding, searching and sometimes finding, and about the poets' history themselves with translations of some of their poems. How do you like the final product there?
Oh, I was very pleased with it. I think it's the best thing I've ever written, but it's after this long process of learning to write and learning to accept and seek out criticism. I think there were 5 different people who looked through that manuscript at one point and threw this out or recommended I get rid of that and rewrite this and use this tense, whatever. But I think, yeah, I'm very pleased with it. That's why I told my publisher after I finished it, I said, this is the last book I'm ever going to write. I won't do better than this. And I'm very pleased with it. And it came out this January. It's a very long book. I was surprised the publisher published it. It was over 400 pages long, because it was a long trip. I wrote it as I conceived it. I told myself, I'm going to take a 30-day trip in China. And I'll write the book as a 30-day journal. And so I wrote it as a 30. Every day I would seek out different graves, homes, whatever. Some days there'd just be one poet involved. Sometimes there'd be 4 or 5 poets. As I began with Confucius and
Now, it wasn't a 30-day. There was a 30-day trip interrupted substantially. Why don't you say why?
Well, yeah. When I got to day 17, I have a friend who has made his living taking Zen groups to China, and suddenly he couldn't. He had a Zen group waiting in near Hong Kong, ready to begin a 2-week trip, and he couldn't make it. He couldn't be there, so he asked me to interrupt my trip to go help him out, and he twisted my arm with money too. So I interrupted my trip on day 17, went down, led that tour, but then I had to go back home. My wife didn't want me to be away that long. So I went back, and 6 months later I came back, and I picked right up where I left, day 17, and continued on till day 25. And when I was on day 25 looking for a hermit's grave, I broke my ankle.
That was the interruption I was thinking of. I'd forgotten the other one.
Yeah, so I had to have surgery in China. Then it was, of course, bungled, and I had to have it redone in America. And then it took me, again, it was 6 months later, I came back to China again. And so it took me 3 trips to finish that 30-day trip, and 3 different bottles of whiskey, too, to pour on the graves of these poets.
So if you were trying to tell somebody who had no concept of Buddhism or Zen or Taoism why they ought to check it out, what would you say?
Well, I would ask them if they're really interested in themselves, then they should see if there's something about themselves that they would like to explore, that would make them feel that this life is worth living.
How would the Tao or the Dharma help them do that?
Well, it would depend on what kind of person they are. Like in China, for example, there's 3 different spiritual paths. The Confucian, the Taoist, and the Buddhist, and they attract very different people. It's like this. I would say there's no sense in following any of these paths if you don't think of self as being in a burning house. That there's something wrong right now, and I need to change. I need to get out of here. In China, there are 3 doorways leading outside of that house. We're all seeking. We have some unease, the burning house image. There's something wrong, and if I can just get out of here, everything will be at peace. There'll be harmony, peace. And so there's 3 ways of seeking harmony in China. One is social harmony. That's the Confucian door. One is body harmony, and that's the Taoist path. And one is mind harmony, and that's the Buddhist path. So we can't walk through 3 doors at once. We choose a door, just the kind of people we are. The Confucian is attracted by the idea of working toward social harmony, and the Taoist towards physical harmony. And when I say body or physical harmony, there are different bodies. In Taoism, you have 4 different. There's 4 different bodies. You have the flesh body, the chi body, the essential body, the spiritual bodies. But it's still it's a sense of a body, and you're trying to put that body at rest, make it happy, peace, harmonious. So you do that as a Taoist, and for Buddhist, it's mind harmony. If your unease is psychological, mental, then you're probably going to be attracted by the Buddhist path more than the Taoist path. And of course, once you're outside of the house, they're all the same.
You're outside.
You're outside, and then whether you're Buddhist or a Taoist, and then at that point, then it is easy to practice all 3. And when you ask some Chinese people what religion they believe in, they sort of scratch their heads because they believe in them all. They're all quite useful, and I'm sure there'd be lots of people in China nowadays who would add the Christian path to that too, or the Muslim path.
There's not the same kind of jealousy that there has been historically in the Christian tradition or the Islamic tradition, where different schools end up literally warring with each other sometimes.
No, there's never, to my knowledge, and I've read a few books about Chinese history. To my knowledge, there's never been any ideological conflict in China in the spiritual realm.
It's more somebody wants to be emperor, and so does somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, there's been conflict, but it's been ideological. It's been the kind of people, I have these ideas, and you have those ideas, but the ideological conflict has not led to killing people or harming people.
Ideological, in a sense, the Mao's rebellion, the revolution in China, was ideological, but certainly not religious.
That's true. That would be, in a sense, an exception, because some people could look on it as having as being a kind of Confucianism, but it's certainly one that was different. You don't get Taoists or Buddhists or Confucians until modern times killing people because of what they believed. The only time that there were some persecutions of Buddhists in China was because in ancient times, if you built a Buddhist monastery and you had some land around it, it was tax exempt. And sometimes people would hide their wealth by giving it to the Buddhists, but then really keeping it. And so there are certain times in Chinese history there would be so much land that would be tax exempt, it was cutting into imperial revenues, and the government would have a purge of Buddhists, and they often killed people, not to the extent of the Cultural Revolution, but there'd be some deaths, but it was not an ideological cause of their being killed.
But it sounds like what you're saying, in terms of religion in China, if you analogize it to the U.S., is that it would seem silly to most people, and you certainly don't have to decide, okay, I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Mormon, or I'm a Jew, or I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm in the Church of Christ. You're a person who's drawing the best of all of those. But you're taking what you feel Catholicism has to offer you and what you feel Judaism may have to offer you, or the Church of Latter-day Saints. Is that kind of what you're saying about the relationship between Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and perhaps Christianity in China?
Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, for those who take it really seriously, or sincerely, it's a little bit different. But for the average Chinese, they see religion as a stock portfolio. It's silly to put all your money into Buddhism, because all of these religions are supported by by people who, shall we say, are more interested in making a living, but they acknowledge the fact that there's things they don't understand, and certainly one of those things is the afterlife. What's going to happen after I die? And so these various spiritual paths, including Christianity, of course, have a different answer for what that involves, and a Chinese person will generally help support a Christian church and a Buddhist temple and a Taoist shrine, and not think of it as contradictory at all. They're happy to see these spiritual paths alive and well and flourishing, because they feel they'll be helped somehow by their connection as being supportive of these traditions. I mean, that's just your general the faithful. But again, they don't go around and register themselves as Buddhists or Taoists or anything. That's your average Chinese person. But of course, you do get people who become monks and nuns and take a more active role in the participation of these traditions, and you never see any conflict in China about a Taoist priest and a Buddhist nun.
Probably worth mentioning that, as well as translating ancient Chinese poets and various Buddhist sutras, you did a new translation a few years ago, the Tao Te Ching.
That's true. And
why did you choose to do that?
Well, for the money. I mean, we're not talking a lot. I think my publisher gave me a $5,000 advance. No, but I don't mean to be funny, but it's true. I'm a translator, and I translate books, and I live on the royalties. And there's a big market for the Tao Te Ching, and it's one of the world's most translated books. So there's a lot of competition in that marketplace. But I thought maybe it's time for me to.
Okay, so that was why you did it, and as you did it, as a Buddhist and what have you, you were focusing much more deeply on the Tao Te Ching than you ever had in order to translate it. Did you feel you learned a lot?
Oh, well, sure, yeah. And of course, the reason I translated wasn't just to make the money. The reason I translate is because I choose certain texts because I want to learn something. All the books I've translated, whether the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, the Lankavatara, in this case the Tao Te Ching, is because these are great texts of great profound wisdom, and so as a translator, you force yourself to learn about them. You can read the Tao Te Ching and think you understand it, and maybe you do. But if you have to translate it, then you spend so much time with every word.
I remember that you went back and learned some Urdu to work on that one.
Oh,
was that something else?
Oh no, that was for the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra. I had to learn some Sanskrit. I had to become conversant with Sanskrit dictionaries and Sanskrit materials without really knowing Sanskrit. But I could stand on someone else's shoulders. Like I used an analysis, a grammatical analysis of the Diamond Sutra, done in Chinese. So I'm able to read Chinese. I could see how every word, every phrase of the Diamond Sutra was handled in Sanskrit without really knowing Sanskrit.
Let me ask you one last question. If anybody's listening and is unfamiliar with Buddhism, or specifically with Zen Buddhism, what would you particularly recommend as a few ways in, basically books that people might read to gain an introduction?
Well, my own path has been more or less Buddhist, and I remember the first book I read that inspired me with that tradition was Alan Watts's The Way of Zen. There's, of course, Chogyam Trungpa's Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And then there's Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. The Beginner's Mind book is another great book. So I would say any of those three books are easy ways for someone unfamiliar with these traditions to learn a lot, and they're written in ways that are easily they inspire you. It's easy to get excited about that tradition by reading any of those three books. I wouldn't recommend any of my own. After you've been inspired, maybe you want to read these sacred texts, and that's sort of what I focus on.
That'd be the second level. Or,
yeah, I don't write about Buddhism.
Buddhism 303, not 101.
Sure. I find it hard to write about Buddhism, but I like to write about the Dharma using the language of the sutras, and then talk about that language and how it expresses the teaching of Buddhism.
Did you ever read Thich Nhat Hanh's, I guess it was a novel based on Buddha or Life of the Buddha?
No, I've never. I bought that book and I took a look at it once because I was interested in possibly translating the Buddha Charita, Ashvaghosha's the first account ever written by the Buddha about the Buddha's life around the time of Christ. And so I was collecting different books, Western in English, where people were telling the story of the Buddha's life, and I didn't read it, but I read a couple chapters in it, and it wasn't what I was looking for. When I set out to write a book or translate a book, I buy at least 30 books.
Sure.
I want to see what other people are saying, both in English and in Chinese. I tell people, they ask me why do you use the name Red Pine when I translate? It's because I feel that I'm helped by other forces, and so as a translator or a writer, there's just all kinds of help you can get if you open yourself up to it.
So in a sense, the product is not a product purely of Bill Porter.
I don't share royalties.
The novel might be.
Yeah, I get a lot of help from a lot of people.
But you don't pay them off.
I don't share royalties. There's not enough to go around.
I hear you.
So anyway,
right,
thank you very much.
To go. And
it's been great talking with you, Peter.
Okay, great talking with you.
You have been listening to a KTAL interview with writer Bill Porter, who has written numerous books on China and Buddhism. Under the name Red Pine, he has translated numerous ancient Chinese poets and Buddhist texts. The interview occurred in Las Cruces in September 2015.